Hello, welcome to the second lecture of this Unit 3 on methods, tools, and techniques for research and evaluation in narrative medicine. In this lecture, we will present and discuss some tools for evaluating a narrative approach. Mainly, we will focus on the semi-structured and unstructured interview. In addition, the lecture will give some examples of semi-structured interviews already used in narrative medicine and which facilitate the collection of empirical material. Some software to facilitate the task of transcription will also be present. If we understand spirituality as the search for the sacred or the divine through any life experience, the qualitative method is the most appropriate way to approach this experience. Within this method, narrative medicine emerges as a methodology that can be adjusted to the needs of the patient, but also to the needs of the people on the other side, health professionals or researchers. The first step in a research project is to formulate our research question, which we must try to answer. Once this question has been formulated, it is time to choose the most appropriate methodology to answer it. Narrative methods are particularly appropriate when researching experiences over time, as in the case in this course, spirituality. One of the characteristics of narrative medicine research is that the objects we study are actually subjects. These subjects themselves have the capacity to produce narrative. If these stories are the empirical data we need, the fundamental instrument we will need to get to them is the question. Two important aspects to be able to work with narrative medicine are knowing how to ask in the right way and knowing how to listen without haste, with enough time so that the person who is speaking to us can produce the story that unravels what is in their subjective world. Narrative is a way of understanding one's own and others' actions, of organizing events and objects into a meaningful whole, and of relating and seeing the consequences of action and events over time. The fundamental instrument we have in narrative medicine is the narrative interview. We should not confuse this type of interview with quantitative questionnaires, which have a series of answers to choose from and therefore leave no room for the subject narrative to emerge. In the narrative interview, the researcher invites participants to tell what happened and allows them to speak without interruption until the story is finished. The interview is structured through chronology, linking events in time, and plot, use of metaphors, images, and rhetorical devices. It is not a question, let's us remember, of putting numerical data into value, but of understanding a space of experience. The interview can be semi-structured or non-structured. In the semi-structured interview, the interviewer will have a series of questions set in advance. To do this, the researcher will draw up a detailed script of the question to be asked to the person to be interviewed, organized by themes or dimensions. This type of interview is usually sequenced, which allows researchers who are new to the art of questioning to be more confident in their approach to the interview. A very interesting example of this type of interview is the McGill Illness Narrative Interview, a semi-structured interview model adapted for illness experience. This interview was initially developed to explore individuals' experience of illness in a community-based study of health-seeking medically and explaining symptoms and use of mental health service. The initial protocol was based on young experience with ethnographic interviews in Ethiopian communities and primary care settings in Israel. The structure of the mini emerged from more basic assumptions about the nature of knowledge structure underlying illness narratives. This type of semi-structured interview can allow us to delve, for example, into areas such as spirituality. Indeed, some of the questions in this interview are aimed precisely at the impact of the illness on the patient's spirituality. On the other hand, we also find the unstructured or non-structured interview with a more emergent and conversational style. The non-structured interview is an earlier step than the semi-structured interview and only organizes the category that the interviewer is going to address, leaving some space for the spontaneity of the moment and the atmosphere generated in the interview. This type of interview is recommended for collecting life stories, for example, and is best used by more experienced interviews or researchers. The questions should only serve to preserve the flow of the story, and it is the experience of the researcher that can help to improve the data collected. Indeed, the question itself may be presented in the form of a short narrative fragment and invite the respondent to continue the story. The interviewer, therefore, plays a key role. The challenge of narrative research is not to control the subjectivity, inconsistency, or emotionality that emerge from the story, but to capture these phenomena as data and interpret them appropriately. The validity of this research process relies heavily on the reflexive awareness of the researcher. The researcher must recognize and engage with this emotional dimension, thus turning sympathy, joy, disgust, and even mixed emotions into research data. Regardless of the choice of interview, there are few things to consider before starting the interview. First of all, the location of the interview. It should be a place where the person to be interviewed feels comfortable. The lighting. The lighting should be neutral and well distributed throughout the space. Furniture. Interviewer and patients should be on the same level. Obstacles should be avoided that impede the observation of nonverbal message, as nonverbal language also conveys experience. Noise. The isolation of the place should be ensured as much as possible, and always try to make sure that there are no interruptions. It is also important to be able to obtain a recording that allows us to transcribe the patient's words without problem. The narrative interview will usually have to follow a series of stages. Beginning of the interview. This phase consists of an introduction, if you do not already know the interview, and an explanation of the purpose of the interview. The aim is to create a friendly atmosphere in which the person feels comfortable. This part of the interview has come to be called wrap. Process of or development of the interview. It will depend on the type of interview we are going to carry out. In the semi-structured interview, the style is more rigid and will depend on the plan of question that had been developed, with greater time control so that the interview will be quicker. In the non-structured interview, the aim is to let the interview speak in a more spontaneous way, just trying to touch on some topic but without asking questions if the patient does not leave room for silence. Closing the interview. Once of all the questions have been asked, in the case of the semi-structured interview, or the topic that were considered necessary have been addressed, in the case of the structured interview, the interview should be closed, always leaving a space for the interview to express what may have been left unsaid. It is also important to give feedback on how the interview went. The data in this type of research will be derived from the video or audio transcripts we make of the interview, together with the interviewer's notes taken during the interview. This will be the material that we will later work with and analyze. Transcribing a narrative interview can be a long and difficult task, but there are different software that can facilitate this type of task, such as the Nuance Dragon program or the Express Transcribe software. In the next lecture, we will explain how to go about working with this type of material. This is the end of lecture 2. See you in the next lecture.